Arunabha, thank you so much for joining me. A very broad question first. The climate crisis, as you defined it in a recent column, is no longer a problem that's out there. And you've acknowledged the fact that India Inc. is now calling it the single biggest business risk. What's changed almost seemingly subtly in, let's say, in the last 3 to 6 months as compared to earlier? Because my sense is that it's not like they were denying it earlier, but there seems to be a more active acknowledgement of the problem.
I think there has been a three-step change over the last few years. The first was in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed and India submitted its nationally determined contributions. There was a sense that, okay, now India is making some commitments about mitigation of emissions. And that did result in this thinking within the energy sector, particularly the power sector, that we've got to get serious about how we build out our renewable energy and so forth. But that is one part of Indian business. But the good thing there is the bulk of our renewable energy capacity has been built by the private sector. So this, in a way, it was not just a new industry that got created, but it was an industry that got created by the private sector, which was not historically the case with, older energy sources. The second shift happened in 2021, exactly 2 years ago. The 1st of November 2021 is when Prime Minister Modi in Glasgow announced the Panchamrit, as well as the net zero commitment as part of it for India to get to net zero by 2070. Now, that then woke up the broader set of Indian industry that this was, as I've argued before, not just an energy transition, but a call for an economic transformation. What is happening now, I would say, the third shift, which we are sort of underway in our sort of business consciousness, is internalizing that in addition to the opportunity, there's also a real risk that we are facing in terms of extreme weather and how that extreme weather not just impacts, small, the huts of small farmers somewhere, but how it can disrupt business operations, how drought can disrupt water availability for industry, how a flood can disrupt operations in a tech center like Bangalore and, prevent people from getting to work, or how construction industry, which is a big employer of people in emerging markets, can severely get impacted when you have heat stress and lower productivity of the labor. So internalizing that this is now happening is a reason why some businesses at least are trying to ask themselves, where do I make those investments? How do I make sure they are protected, that they're protected against these risks that are emerging and rising over time?
Right. And what's the manifestation of this in terms of response? Obviously, some people would do more than the others, but how are you viewing it?
It can manifest in two different ways. One is that if you see some clear opportunity for a new business line, if you're an energy company, then you want to invest in renewables. But if you're not an energy company, you think that there is an area of work that you can get into, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's electric mobility, whether it's green hydrogen. We're seeing, to an extent, a great deal of private sector interest in engaging with these emerging business opportunities. To give an example, we see, for instance, that in renewables, a lot of investment is coming in from sovereign wealth funds, but also private equity and public equity. But in green hydrogen, we're seeing a lot of big conglomerates with large balance sheets committing to invest huge amounts of capital. But in electric mobility, it's interesting, where again, we are seeing exponential growth. Last year alone, we suddenly got over 1 million electric vehicles sold, most of them in the two-wheeler, three-wheeler category. We see a lot of venture funding coming into the electric mobility. That's one way to look at it. The other way that it's manifesting, Govind, is that some companies, particularly those that are in more vulnerable areas, say coastal areas that are vulnerable to storm surges and cyclones, are trying to now get a handle on what is the risk, physical climate risk exposure that their assets are going to face. But this is not something that has been widely internalized across Indian industry. And I think this, over the coming years, this is something that they will have to wake up to.
Right. And, between the second and the third shift that you pointed out, and it's quite interesting. So, one is the opportunity, and people have invested in renewable energy. Looking at a report or a statement from Amazon in India saying that they've now invested more than 1 gigawatt in renewable energy capacity, which I'm sure has various reasons for it, but it's contributing to the solution. But taking care of one end of the problem, if so, but what are people doing, if at all, if they can rather, on the other end, which is, where lives are getting affected and so on, and which may go beyond just protecting my factory or ensuring that I create another disaster recovery center and so on.
Just to use your Amazon example, I don't want to comment on that individual example, but the idea here is that companies are now going to be evaluated and eventually mandated to control and abate their scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1, that's coming directly from the company's activities. Scope 2, from the indirect use of inputs such as the electricity that Amazon will have to purchase to run its data centers, right, or its warehouses. So making sure that that electricity is clean is going to be the job of large corporations. But eventually, 3 will also come in. How your products and services are used, the indirect emissions that emerge from it, from fuel-related activities, from transportation of your products, from waste generated in your operations, and so on and so forth. So increasingly, we will see, especially for companies that have footprints across multiple jurisdictions, that in a way, earlier it used to be, devolve into the lowest common denominator. Now you will have to align your activities to the highest environmental regulations that are emerging wherever you're operating. And then you will have to align all your work towards those highest standards. So if the EU is moving to a certain level of standards, then a company in India hoping to operate in EU, not just exporting to the EU, will have to start aligning there, regardless of what the Indian standards are. But then the other thing, and I drew attention to this even in my column that you referred to, is that companies will also have some degree of responsibility of the broader area in which they're operating. And that's not just disaster relief, because ultimately your labor is coming from that area. Maybe your supply chains are in that area. Maybe your ancillary industries and inputs are coming from that area. So unless you are thinking about climate risk beyond the factory boundary to see how disruptions anywhere along the supply chain can damage your business prospect, you will continue working on this issue as a below the bottom line CSR activity. Once you internalize that supply chain disruptions, just like as we are experiencing for other geopolitical reasons, that climate-induced supply chain disruptions are bad for business, it becomes an above the bottom line issue. And the sooner companies start doing that, it becomes prudent, just like you and I will go for an annual health checkup to ensure that we get the right insurance for ourselves. It's important that companies go through their annual health checkup and report that to the regulators, right? That this is my risk exposure. Now I need to protect myself.
Arunabha, thank you so much for joining me.
All right. Thank you, Govind.